Yeah, thank you so much for the introduction. Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me here. As mentioned, I'll be talking about some tools that we've worked on, some studies we've done on empowering users and communities with social media governance and online platforms. As mentioned, this is a lab this is all work kind of done as part of a lab that I started at UW about 2.5 years ago now during the pandemic. And we kind of sit at this intersection of CS design and social science. So a lot of the topics I'll be talking about today have to do with thinking about social science topics, but incorporating them into the design of social media platforms and the technical aspects of like building them as well. So this is going to be a little bit more of a design-oriented talk as opposed to computational social science, but I think should hopefully still be interesting to you all. All right, so just to get into it, I'm not going to spend too much time on this because I think most of you are aware of many of the problems that we face with online social platforms today. Issues like hate speech proliferating on these platforms, misinformation spreading on social media, people getting harassed on social media, getting harassed off social media, as well as radicalization of many topics as well. And unfortunately, a lot of the debates around content moderation as they currently are happening on social media are centered specifically around these topics of like specific thresholds, specific policies. Should we moderate more of this or that? And also a lot of discussion about specific cases. For instance, should we unban Trump being like a very prominent case? Should we let certain people on or off particular platforms? And a lot of that discussion has been happening centered around the opinions of the creators of these platforms. So like people in government will haul folks like Mark Zuckerberg into Congress and talk about what specific policies Facebook has. Or as we've seen recently with the acquisition of Twitter by Elon Musk, a lot of things are changing on that platform in terms of its governance, particularly at the whims of one person, Elon himself. And so kind of elevating the opinions of the leaders of these platforms, not necessarily engaging with the communities or the users on these platforms when it comes to that. And so I argue that this kind of discussion of this policy, this case, that case is this kind of never-ending loop, and maybe we should be thinking more fundamentally about how we're doing governance on social media in the first place. Like, is this actually how we want social media governed? What is it about the underlying processes by which content moderation happens? And is that something that we think is good? Who gets to take part in these decisions? Should it just be the Elon Musks of the world? And is the process by which all these decisions are being made legitimate? Do we think that this is how we want our speech to be governed? How we want our online social spaces to be governed? So kind of tackling these more fundamental aspects instead of at the policy specific level, I want to bring up some of the particular assumptions that underpin quite a lot of the content moderation processes on social media today. And I also want to say what's wrong with those particular assumptions and maybe how we should rethink some of those assumptions. So two that I want to bring up. The first one here is one assumption is that we can and should come up with a single set of policies that will be broadly agreed upon and can be enforced consistently across a large and diverse user base around the world. So I want to argue that this is kind of a preposterous thing to say, and maybe, you know, it's something where maybe there's a bit of hubris here in platforms thinking that this is possible. I argue that this task is fundamentally impossible when we're thinking about millions, billions of people in different countries, people with different cultural backgrounds, people in different communities, trying to come up with a single set of policies around things like what is objectionable content is, I argue, impossible to be able to do across such a diverse group. And I also want to argue that it's undesirable, that plurality is something that is good about our societies, and something that we should foster. So this is one assumption I'd like to tackle, and just some empirical work to back up some of these claims I'm making. So this is a paper that came out 2 years ago, led by someone named Zhang, who's now at Meta. And they went out and did a study and looked at how people think about the severity of harmful content being like the categories that Facebook, for instance, prohibits on their platform, and looked at how that varied across countries around the world, and found that there is significant variation in how people think about the harmfulness of different categories of content. And I really liked this quote. The general variability serves as evidence against social media platforms' current approach of using a single universal set of rules to regulate global users. This falsely implies that people view harmful content consistently across the world. And in fact, this is not true. They have examples of all sorts of different categories where people in the West think is very harmful, people in the East think is not, vice versa, broadly. And I also want to call it in particular the category of harassment, one aspect of content moderation policies, although I think this is also true writ large, like misinformation, etc. We find that there's a lot of disagreement on it. But harassment in particular is this kind of thing that's just extremely slippery, like very contextual, oftentimes very personalized to target a particular individual or a particular identity group. So we've done interviews with people who deal with harassment and heard lots of stories of these kinds of things that you wouldn't realize are necessarily harassment until you get to know the person or get to know the context. So for instance, like talk to trans activists who were receiving comments on things like their YouTube videos, purposefully using their dead name or misgendering them. We've seen examples of different kinds of bullying among teenagers where they're using very coded in jokes and doing things like cropping, etc., to bully. We've also seen different kinds of stalking behavior that is like very targeted to a specific individual so that they can kind of know that they're being stalked, but other people don't really know. So yeah, it's very difficult to understand when someone's being harassed. Try to imagine being a content moderator in some other country, trying to understand the context of a report of harassment like this. And another thing that people have found is that people have very different ideas of what is harassment to them as well. So this was something that we found in our interviews as well, but also this is a study done by another group that looked at these toxicity classification algorithms. Like Google Jigsaw has this algorithm called the Perspective API, which labels the toxicity of different messages. And they found that when they asked a lot of people, I think over 10,000 people, about these toxicity classifications, different people have very different perspectives on that level of toxicity. And if you can tune the algorithm for individual preference, you can improve it by a lot in terms of accuracy. So very different preferences, in particular when it comes to things like harassment, hate speech, toxicity. We've also done a study looking at communities, specifically subreddits, to understand the values that different communities have and how they also vary. And so we did a large-scale survey, just deployed it to a large group of people on subreddits in Reddit, finding that we can distill down to a high-level set of categories, but there's just this broad range of how different communities value these categories of values differently. So considerable variability from community to community. Also within community, we also noticed a lot of variability. So for instance, just some fun things that we saw. The thing that members disagree the most on is how safe their community is in terms of value. And then another thing that we found was that moderators versus non-moderators in the same community have really significant disagreement on the importance of democracy to them. So it turns out moderators don't like democracy. Yeah, maybe not surprising. Okay, so assumption number 2 that I want to tackle is this idea that we should be able to, as users, have this kind of frictionless power to post and share as much as we want to as many people as we want, and yet kind of no responsibility, no part in this aspect of the collective governance of all these things that we're sharing. And so I argue that this kind of role-based bifurcation of users as creators of content, and then platforms and platform operators as curators of content, and sort of no mingling between that, ends up putting kind of disproportionate power into the hands of platforms and a few people at these platforms, and it also doesn't scale. So I'll say a little bit more about that. So, you know, social media platforms have really revolutionized our ability to speak, right? So in the last couple of decades, we've been able to go from, you know, a lot of effort to get your writing, your thoughts, your opinions out into the world, to now being able to, in a matter of seconds, create something and, you know, use these really rich authoring tools to create something that's multimedia, et cetera, and then be able to share that to hundreds, thousands, millions of people in the course of a day. So that's really great. It's empowered a lot of people. But on the flip side, there hasn't been this additional kind of aspect of it, which is this power to curate side. So if everybody is able to speak, we all have this like megaphone in this giant hallway or this giant hall, and we're all talking to each other. Being able to separate that signal from that noise becomes incredibly important, right? And it's something that we don't really have. I like this, the title of this one Atlantic article, "People Aren't Meant to Talk This Much," which is kind of pointing out this fact that like we see so much dialogue, so much discussion, information than we ever have before. And that's hard. That's hard for us to manage. It's hard for us to comprehend. And I think just kind of like the overload of that contributes to a lot of the downstream kind of problems that we have today, like with misinformation. And frankly, we just don't have very many tools on this curation side, and we don't have many opportunities to engage in this curation side. Mostly we have this side, the power to speak. Okay, so speaking has had this kind of massive scaling that has happened in the last several years. However, the shaping of how that speech is being spread, is being encountered, is being moderated, that's in a lot of these platforms primarily centralized under the platform. And so that itself doesn't really scale well. The way that this happens today is that, you know, platforms are employing these contract moderators. This is this permanent workforce of workers who are living under kind of stressful conditions, getting paid very little. It's very traumatizing oftentimes to look at this content. And even though platforms are employing like tens of thousands of these people, they're still not able to catch kind of the just like deluge of harmful content that is spread on social media. So it still doesn't scale. And also we now have these people who are kind of like, you know, taking on all the evils of society for us. Is that necessarily what we want? Is that the price to pay for having social media? I'd like to think that this isn't something that we have to do. Okay, so, you know, why is it that we give people this immense power to post and to spread content, both good and bad content, but, you know, little to no responsibility? And the flip side of that power, when it comes to the ramifications, and, you know, this is a quote from Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility. So these two aspects kind of coming hand in hand. So one question I have is, you know, what if instead of this consumer model, which is how we often think about social media, that, you know, these platforms are companies and we are being catered to, and the experience of it is maybe closer to like a mall where you're in this like curated space, you are being catered to, there's advertisements and things kind of to keep you, and content is there to kind of keep you around so that you're creating profits for the company. Instead, moving to something more like a citizen model. So this is a picture of a park where maybe there's a little bit more of a stewardship model to it, that you are a citizen of this park. Maybe, you know, you do things like you pay taxes to keep the park maintained. You are part of a community that uses the park, and you with that community get to decide what happens in the park, and you set the norms of activity within the park. So thinking more towards the citizen model of social media. Okay, so then summarizing from those two assumptions, instead of platforms where there's this one size fits all moderation process, doesn't fit people well. In addition, users having this immense power to post at scale, little to no input into curation, which right now doesn't scale. I argue that we need to put more of these governance powers into the hands of users. And the benefits of this are that not only can users then localize, customize governance to fit the norms of their particular social spaces, their particular social relationships, but also by giving them this power, this responsibility, they can become kind of co-stewards in its future success in a way that scales. So with that, I want to talk a little bit about how one would actually do that. So I'll take you through this diagram. Say right now, this is how governance looks on many social media platforms. There's kind of centralization at the top, which is at the platform level, and that governs kind of all these users that are at this level below. Okay, and we're including both things like large human moderation teams, classification algorithms to classify certain content, recommender algorithms that's curating the posts that people see. How do we move more of that governance or broadly curation closer to users? So I have a couple ways. So one is perhaps transferring some of the powers to users to be able to customize moderation and do curation for themselves. So shrinking the role up there, bringing some of it down here to end users. Second, thinking about this at the community level. So users can join communities, subscribe to various collectives or quote unquote middleware that can conduct some governance on behalf of the community or the collective. And we see this already in some cases with some platforms. And then the third part is kind of in the situations where you do want platforms to be making some top-down decisions, can we get more user input? Oh, I have input there twice. When it needs to make these kind of top-down decisions, can we get buy-in from users? Yeah. Okay, and so that's what I'm going to be talking about today. So kind of at the platform level, making platform decisions, can we design more legitimate processes for those kind of platform-wide decisions? At the community level, okay, if we want communities to be able to do governance, a lot of times these are run by volunteers. Could they have more powerful tools to be able to do that governance and iterate from there? And as well, all the way down to the individual user level, could there be more powerful tools for users to be able to better be able to control what they individually see? And so I'm going to lead into that, and hopefully I'll have time to go through all of this. But I'll be talking about a bunch of different projects that we're doing at each of these levels to provide more kind of user-led, community-led governance. I'm going to start from the bottom and then go all the way up. So first, talking a bit about personal moderation tools, which is something that I've recently started working on. What are personal moderation tools? These include things like these controls. You actually may not be aware of this because it's kind of hard to find in some of these platforms. But for instance, Instagram introduced this last year, where there's kind of moderation done by Instagram on what they call sensitive topics. So like sexual content, violent content, etc. But you can also go into settings and there's like a little toggle where you can say like, I'm okay with seeing more sensitive content, or I really prefer not to see sensitive content, or like stay neutral in the middle. So these kind of toggles or sliders to be able to have individuals set personal preferences for where that threshold is for moderation for themselves, instead of having platforms kind of deciding that for everyone. There are many interesting ethical questions about giving individuals the ability to kind of choose their own thresholds for some of these borderline content. This is a screenshot from what I call the Intel fiasco. I don't know if you saw when this happened, but I think this was like a year or so ago. Intel kind of released this tool called Bleep, where you had a bunch of different categories of harmful content, and people could select on a slider how much of it they wanted to see. This was then fed into, I think, like gaming chat systems. But people were like, oh, wait, I can say that I want all, like, ableism and body shaming, LGBTQ hate. So yeah, that seems maybe not great. So interesting ethical questions here. We did a study where we asked people, this is a representative sample of the adult US population, and about 1,000 people took part in this. We found that when given a choice of having the platform decide to take down certain content versus having the option to select a personal threshold, people actually overall prefer the personal threshold. So that was interesting to see. We weren't necessarily expecting that, but there's a slight preference for the personal threshold for these 3 categories of content we tested for: hate speech, violent content, and sexually explicit content. We also conducted interviews with people, kind of talking them through different personal moderation controls, different categories of them, whether or not they personally would want to use something like that. And there are trade-offs. Like, people were kind of talking about various aspects of like whether they would use it, whether they think other people should use it, what they would personally select as their threshold. So I'm not going to go into the details for time reasons, but aspects such as like, how much effort is this going to cause for me, versus like, how much do I think this should actually be the platform's purview? And they think of, you know, issues like degree of harmfulness as the distinction there. A desire oftentimes personally for kind of open-mindedness, saying like, oh, I'm okay with kind of seeing everything. But interestingly, people would say things like, oh, I'm okay with seeing everything, but my mom or my sister or my brother or my friend should use this because I think they should not be able to see more sensitive content, or I think they would be bothered by more sensitive content. So that's kind of interesting, this kind of third person effect that we noticed. And here's a person saying kind of this breakdown between platforms and users. It's a combination of both platforms and users. Otherwise, the thing on the platform typically, again, is it's going to be a team of majority white guys in some corner of the world deciding how an Indian boy is going to get his content. So talking about the necessity of the personalization of this moderation, but at the same time, again, from other quotes, degree of harmfulness, meaning that sometimes we want the platform in control. We have some ongoing work on personal moderation tool design, thinking about slider UIs, word filters, other kinds of toggles, thinking about explanations to people of like what these categories are, what it means for something to be like very toxic versus somewhat toxic. That's kind of difficult, as well as like giving people feedback when they change their threshold, how one should do that. And then kind of the underlying machine learning model or rule-based system. And then I also want to mention, we have some ongoing work thinking about this in the recommendation algorithm context. So, being able to design your own feed recommender system, for instance. We've seen that engagement-based algorithms maybe aren't necessarily the best. It turns out reverse chronological is not great either. So what do we have instead? I don't know. We're learning from people what they want in terms of their feed curation. Okay, and then the second thing I wanted to talk about at this user level is this issue when, okay, you give users the ability to curate for themselves, but what if having to do this myself turns out to be too much for me to handle? And this becomes a problem in the context of harassment, where maybe someone is getting tons of messages for whatever reason that are designed to hurt them, and then they're getting overwhelmed with all the things that they have to do to moderate that. And so we came up with this idea, in addition to personal moderation, this idea of friend source moderation, where people can help each other do personal moderation. And this we've done in the context of harassment. We interviewed a lot of people who deal with harassment. They come from all walks of life, unfortunately. And then we found that people get harassed, I've already mentioned this, in many different contextual ways, different ideas about what is harassment, different ideas about how they want to do it. So it really does feel like it's not something where the platform should do this, or maybe like can do a good job of this potentially. And then second, kind of the one effective strategy that we saw people using was giving a password to their friend and having their friend kind of go in and clean up their inbox for them. And so that gave us the idea to build this system, which incorporates this idea of friend source moderation. So here's a quote from one of our interviewees. My best friend has the passwords to all my social media accounts. It was like, please log into my Twitter, block everyone, go in and figure it out for me. And so here is this case again where we give people personal moderation tools, but for various reasons, maybe they're dealing with too much harassment, maybe it's just too emotionally draining for one person to deal with, turning towards friends to kind of spread the load. Yes?
Just a clarification on this one. Did you see instances where the friend actually went in and deleted the friend's content, saying that, oh, that was offensive, we should not have said that, because it's due to this public way. So this is like helping them moderate other people's things that they could, you know, emotionally draining. But did you actually look at it and say, you know, you actually said that and that could be effective, I think we remove that. I should remove them. You did.
Interesting. We hadn't seen that. It was more like, oh, this person, like these people are hurting you. I'm going to like get rid of that for you. I'll maybe report these people for you, because reporting is kind of this laborious task also right now. I might summarize to you kind of what happened. Like, yeah, like you got 10 messages from your stalker again. Like I reported them. Like, just so you know, like they said this or that. And like, so something like that. It's kind of being this intermediary, which I think helps emotionally, that you have someone there with you when you're encountering this content. And then that person kind of helps to act as a shield for you when you're getting.
You sort of have a reflective after.
Friends saying that, hey, I should just make up and look how you hear public and what you say, and then say, oh, I can actually make sure that content is my.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, we see this oftentimes in the context of like dating, right? Like where you get your friend to help look at your dating profile and like think about, oh, like maybe you should preface it this way, or like use this kind of photo because I think, you know, it'll be helpful in this or that way. Yeah. But yeah, I think turning towards friends for particularly these like interpersonal kinds of things is fairly common. Okay, so I want to then move on to the second part, which was the community level. Before though, just kind of provocation. So could all governance be pushed down to individual choice? And then this platform is just acting as this neutral host of content, quote unquote neutral, except for maybe, okay, like illegal stuff, they should take that down. Maybe this is a very strong free speech stance, and there are people that make this argument. There are, however, lots of reasons why you might not want to just kind of push everything down to the users. So one, this is going to be significant labor for users, potentially a poor user experience for them. They may not want to come back to your system. This does increase barriers for marginalized groups. So as we've seen in the harassment case, I argue it's probably inefficient. There's likely a lot of overlap between preferences of different clusters of people. It seems like it would be a lot of wasted effort to make everybody kind of do this for themselves. And then also, you know, we should take advantage of the fact that some people just care way more about this than others. This is kind of the very well-known like 99-1 rule or Pareto principle, 80-20 rule, that some people are really active, they participate a lot, they care a lot about governance, they want to be leaders in their community and volunteer, are civically minded people. And then there are people who just want to lurk and just kind of like participate more casually. So given that, we also have this kind of middle layer that I want to talk about, which is tools to support communities or collectives of people doing governance together. And we have a couple projects kind of talking about that. The first one I'll talk about is this project that we have called Policy Kit, and it is inspired by this thing that we noticed, which is that on pretty much all the online community software tools that you use today, all of them, really all of them, they all have this governance model. And it was really just like shocking kind of when I thought about it, that this is the case. I mean, it seems obvious, but when it comes to the governance model of all of these platforms, they have this similar pattern, which is that there are admins and there are mods and there are users. right? This is something familiar to all of you in any community that you participate in online, that there's this kind of top-down structure. And this is incorporating a particular style of governance. It's a style of governance called a roles and permissions model. So basically, when a user tries to do something, encoded into the code software, the software of these platforms itself is something like a permissions table. The system goes and looks up whether a user has the ability to perform whatever action given whatever roles they have in that table, and then that action is approved. So this is technically how governance is encoded in every community software that we use today. However, this isn't the world of governance, right? If you think about it, like permissions models are top down, they're autocratic, and they're primarily punitive. So thinking about all the other different ways that we think about governing, such as like democracy, for instance, if you wanted to do that, it's not that easy. All right, so you would need to either carry it out manually in some kind of ad hoc way. So maybe you're saying like upvotes equals votes or something, and we're conducting polls or something like that. Or you're using one-off software tools like Lumio or one of these other systems that exist out there. And overall, this is just kind of cumbersome, error-prone, hard to maintain. So we thought, okay, like, why is it that all these community software have this particular style of governance? Could we not encode other styles of governance in it such that communities can have whatever style of governance they want? Including things like more democratic models. And going beyond that, like instead of us kind of coming up with these particular styles of governance, could we just let users or communities themselves decide what kinds of governance they want for themselves, suiting their own needs and values? And then broadly, thinking about kind of the civic good angle of this, online communities could also be this way for people to kind of practice and engage with the kind of small d acts of democracy and local civic engagement. And I like this article. Online communities are still catching up to my mother's garden club. This person's talking about an offline community, a garden club that his mother is in, that has all sorts of different governance that's like democratic and circles and deliberative, and online communities just don't have these encoded. Okay, so we built a system called PolicyKit, which is this kind of like technical infrastructure that lets online communities be able to come up with the kind of governance that they want, and then be able to actually carry out that governance on their platform of choice. And the way PolicyKit does this is it is shifting the way our governance is articulated within the code from a permissions kind of articulation to articulating procedures, where a procedure is this kind of way to express a wide range of governance models concisely, including participatory and democratic ones. So the way that works is, instead of going to look up a user's permissions in a permissions table, we instead have a series of policies articulated in PolicyKit. And these policies are these right now kind of short procedural scripts. And we check the policies that govern an action. And then if it passes that policy, goes through that procedure, then the action is approved. And here's an example, pseudocode. Before X can happen, first it must be approved by a majority of community members. So this is kind of like a majoritarian democratic vote. This in PolicyKit right now is kind of written in a short Python script. And we are currently working on kind of like a no-code version of this, where people can import templates and that sort of thing. Okay, so I said that PolicyKit not only lets people author a wide range of governance policies, but it also lets them carry it out on their home platforms. How do we do that? What that means, though, is that PolicyKit is like existing on the server, but we don't want you to have to go to the server all the time, or on this web application all the time. You can just be in your platform of choice. Maybe you're using Slack, maybe you're using Reddit, Discord, etc. And you can be governed by the governance that you've articulated in PolicyKit directly on your platform without having to go to PolicyKit. Here's an example of PolicyKit kind of enacting a voting policy in Slack. How does this work? So PolicyKit does this using platform APIs. So if the platform basically has an API that lets us do this, we can then kind of take over the governance that's already encoded in the platform and instead instate PolicyKit's governance that the community has authored on PolicyKit. So a little bit more about how technically that works. I'm just going to go over this very quickly because I don't think the technical details are that important. But there's a PolicyKit server. There are integrations via platform APIs to various platforms. And there's a policy engine that's kind of listening to things happening on platforms. Right, so we have a listener. And then this policy engine is running through the policies articulated in PolicyKit. For instance, you can have a jury policy for renaming channels on Slack. There's some code that runs. We listen for things and then we revert things that happen on the platform. So we basically say, like, if PolicyKit hasn't decided yet whether something can happen or not, we revert it. That's how we kind of take over the governance on that platform. And then once we go through the process, maybe there's some voting that happens, et cetera. We can actually, once something passes, then actually have it be carried out on the platform. So this is kind of how PolicyKit has its governance, and it's taking over whatever governance is currently on the platform. But yeah, we also have a website on PolicyKit where you can do the authoring. Right now, as I mentioned, it's using Python, but it won't be in the future. And then there's a dashboard where you can see different aspects of what's happening in a community's governance. We have some users. We'd be interested to have you all try it out if you'd like. Okay, how am I doing on time? Should probably go faster. Okay. I also wanted to mention another project where we were looking at content creators who are also themselves kind of communities and community moderators of their comment spaces, right? So if you are a content creator, like on YouTube, you get a lot of comments on your YouTube videos, you actually have the ability to moderate those comments. And in essence, you're being a moderator of your little fan community, sometimes big fan community. And people oftentimes get harassment on these comments, particularly when they're coming from marginalized backgrounds. And the existing tools that people have for dealing with this right now is this tool called word filters, which some of you may be aware of. It's just, as implemented on a lot of these platforms, a box. You type into the box words, and if comments have those words, then they get removed. That's entirely how it works. We talked to a number of content creators that kind of talked about the struggles of using these tools. They're kind of extremely rudimentary. And so we implemented a bunch of features into a new tool called Filter Buddy that kind of helps content creators be able to do things like preview what happens when they would add a word filter, monitor the activity of particular word filters to see how it's doing over time, be able to catch like false positives, being able to share, fork, mix and match word filters with each other, all kinds of things that one would seem kind of obvious to do, I guess. And I think the high level point we want to make here is that this is not like a crazy technically difficult or like wildly innovative system. However, no platforms have any of these features. They have the most rudimentary thing. So kind of calling out the platforms on that. And we have some ongoing work thinking about how to incorporate machine learning versus rules-based approaches here. And then just really briefly, we have some work looking at this in the end-to-end encrypted space, which is very interesting to me, where because of encryption, it kind of forces the platform to take a smaller role in content moderation, right? Because platforms now can't actually see the messages on their platform, and except through things like user reporting, which we have a study showing people don't necessarily turn towards reporting for various reasons. So then how do you do things like counter abuse and issues like misinformation? So we have an ongoing work building a PolicyKit-like system for more flexible community governance on these end-to-end encrypted platforms, where we really think the community has to be the locus point for moderation because the platform cannot be when we want to have abuse prevention. However, some aspects of privacy are still important here because people who are using E2E systems want privacy and then also accountability. So are there still ways that the platform can step in when necessary without necessarily reading all the stuff going on within the community? Happy to talk about that further, but I should move on. Okay, so moving on to the last stage of this, we often do want some kind of moderation happening at the platform level, right? We can't just do everything at the community or at the individual level in many cases. Sometimes you can with things like Mastodon and other federated platforms, but as long as there is a server, there's kind of someone hosting the content, you have to worry about things like CSAM, other kinds of harmful content where you actually want to be overriding the preferences of the communities or particular users on your platform. Hopefully these decisions should be less contentious now that we have more things happening at the community and user level, but it's still pretty weighty because you're making top-down decisions for a lot of people. So this is bringing us back to this original issue of how do we do centralized moderation and kind of all the problems with that. So here, I'm going to talk quickly about kind of this question of legitimacy, how to design legitimacy into platform decision-making. In particular, I've been thinking about aspects of procedural justice and democratic legitimacy. So to break down these terms a little bit more, so perceived legitimacy is this idea that the people being governed feel that they're consenting into the governance that is being imposed upon them. So feeling that the governance that you're under is legitimate. Democratic legitimacy is this idea that aspects of perceived legitimacy can arise through adhering to particular democratic norms. And then procedural justice, this idea that the way in which you make your decision, the process by which you take, the process that you take can also itself be an aspect of legitimacy and perceived legitimacy. So particularly we looked into juries, this governance system that we use offline in a lot of our US courts. Could we bring this online and think about digital juries for content moderation, and particularly thinking about it as this kind of like civics-oriented approach? So not only are we kind of taking a stance by involving everyday citizens in these small deliberative or voting juries to make decisions, but also in that process, they are kind of gaining some education from it. They're learning about content moderation. They're getting some kind of stake in the health of their community. So we did a study. We put a lot of people through juries, kind of looked at how people thought about being in a jury versus kind of the status quo of content moderation today. People overall did feel that it was more democratically legitimate, maybe not surprising. Deliberating juries was rated higher than kind of blind voting juries. And then from kind of people's qualitative feedback, we saw some interesting differences in how people talked about this. So some people talking more about distrust of platforms, other people actually talking about distrust of other people, other jurors. Also the pros and cons of deliberation. Is it better that we hear other people out and potentially change our mind? Or is this actually biasing people's opinions and leading to groupthink? Different perspectives there. However, we did do a follow-up study where we then compared these 4 conditions: algorithms, paid contractors, expert panels, and digital juries. And we said, okay, how do these processes impact people's perceived legitimacy? And in particular, how does alignment of outcomes? So how much does the outcome matching your personal preference for that decision influence perceived legitimacy? And so the way we did this was we came up with a bunch of cases. We randomly picked an outcome for each case, and then we randomly picked a process out of these 4 for each case, and then we showed them to people and asked them, well, how legitimate did you feel that was? And we looked at how both the processes and the outcome influenced it. So summary, interestingly, at this time, a panel of experts performed the best overall. Users still kind of prefer this kind of group decision-making over individual decision-making. However, and this is kind of the caveat, like the alignment of user preference with the decision outcome actually dominated all the tested processes. So basically, if this random outcome that we selected matched your preference, then you were more likely to think it was legitimate. So this is kind of more outcome-based legitimacy as opposed to procedural-based legitimacy. High-level takeaways from these 2 studies. Okay, so we still think that legitimacy can be improved with process. Things like expertise, deliberative bodies seems important, but hard to scale. Outcomes still matter. So, when we're thinking about content moderation, it's often about speed, quality of execution, scale. We can't ignore this kind of scaling part. This all is very relevant to kind of things going on, for instance, in the Facebook oversight board, where they're only able to see like a couple cases a year. Legitimacy is going to take a hit with contentious decisions, kind of no matter what, is our argument. And maybe we're seeing that play out today with like the Supreme Court. Unfortunately, approaches that do scale face with mistrust. I think there's still a lot of work to design legitimacy into those processes. So crowd approaches such as juries, thinking about things like training, two-phase processes with like juries and experts, maybe. Reputation systems among the crowd, maybe. Although, there's questions around how that intersects with like democratic principles of one person, one vote. Mistrust in algorithms still needs further examination, which we saw across the board. Okay, so that's primarily all I wanted to talk about. Just one last point, that this kind of diagram here, it's a multi-level governance model. It's a lot like federalism in the US. We have local, we have state, we have national. And this kind of hierarchical model of governance looks different on different platforms, but there are a lot of platforms that have some element of this. So, we have community-oriented platforms where this middle/state level is the most powerful. We have social networking platforms where it's the platform that's the most powerful. We have kind of alternative systems like Mastodon, where it's really all at the community level. There isn't really a platform. And then end-to-end encrypted platforms where, again, it's at the community, the platform isn't able to do much. So yeah, just kind of pointing out that there's a lot of different ways this can be implemented. And it's interesting to think about the ramifications for these different kinds of platforms. And then just really quickly, I just want to say things I didn't get to talk about. I am thinking about these questions of user and community empowerment to combat issues like misinformation in particular. I'm happy to talk about these with you all after the talk is over, though. And we also do some work on remote collaboration and teamwork, as well as uncertainty and subjectivity and human decision-making. All right, and then hopefully I have some time for questions. I didn't go too long. Thank you.
So we'll open it up for questions. And also we do have until noon, so.
Okay, great.
Don't worry about the time.
So in your earlier slide, you mentioned a study where you had regarding like platform-wide controls for seeing location stuff versus individual controls. And yeah, I guess you said that people tend to prefer individual controls. I was wondering about, because like later you mentioned like, oh, this puts a lot of burden on like the individual, and then this kind of induces the device for like these social media companies to like divest themselves of the responsibility, right? I guess I was wondering, like, I would expect the kinds of people to answer that sort of survey to be kinds of people who would be more likely to prefer individual controls. Is that something that came up in the study, or?
So I think this goes kind of to pros and cons of different kind of study methods and the different data you get back as results. So that first study was a short survey, and it was nationally representative. So it's, thousands, over 1,000 people kind of answering hypothetical questions on a survey that's taking a couple minutes. We did show them things like, a picture of how a personal moderation control could look like. But, it's not the same as like getting them to use it, right? And so I think, and this is, just me pontificating, not like with empirical data yet, but this has kind of played out in some platforms that have tried to implement sliders or these other kinds of things with personalizing recommendation algorithms, is that the vast majority of people are probably not going to be like doing a lot there. They're going to be going with defaults. I do think there's potentially, there's potential things you could do with design to get more or less people to use it. I think the way that a lot of these things are implemented right now is like very hidden and kind of this like settings page, like 3 layers deep. So it's maybe not surprising that like very few people go in and actually edit these moderation settings. If it was kind of more central to the feed, or like something that you're able to do like kind of in situ as you're scrolling through a feed, maybe we get more usage. But I still posit that, you know, for a lot of people, maybe they don't necessarily need to have that level of control. And as a result, defaults are still going to be really important. So maybe that's kind of getting at the differences we see in these studies, where like, hypothetically, if you ask me, like, would I want more control? Like, yeah, I think I would. But then if I went to go and actually use this, maybe I'm like, I don't want to do the effort of doing this. It seems to work okay for now. Yeah. Yeah.
So, I'll give a bit of background on this question. So, long time back, when British introduced railways into India, one of the concerns that Gandhi had was that as people start traveling more and more people start traveling, the diversity of ideas would come in. And until that, before like mass travel happened, people often considered travelers to be like they were highly regarded, and people think that they are bringing something new, like some new knowledge, and they sort of absorb that. But as more people started traveling, the noise in that message started increasing. And people sort of figured out that, you know what, like everyone traveling doesn't express the information. And that has happened to the internet as well, right? Like fast forward, like a few years before social media was there, if you read something online, it was a resource that we use. But now, because that noise is there, users have sort of started ignoring some of the things we need as well. So we talked about like these different levels, but one thing I thought is sort of that we didn't get a chance to talk about is like what the users are like doing that personal moderation while they are consuming the content that they choose to know. So like we have these sort of that one.
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I mean, we are now, I think, doing more system building on the personal moderation side and thinking about how one could actually incorporate this into people's feeds, or when they're at that decision-making point of like, do I follow this person? Do I unfollow this person? I think there's also like temporal aspects to it. Like maybe I want to mute this person for a day or two because they're off on something, or maybe it's topically oriented. We're still kind of doing need finding studies to understand what are these dimensions that people would ideally like to have, and then, you know, how can we then provide those options to people without having to like ask them to like fill out a whole bunch of things or tweak a lot of settings. So yeah, I don't know if that quite gets at your question though. I mean, I think social media has let us look into other people's lives and thought processes and like other cultures like way more than before. If you've heard that phrase, like never meet your heroes or something, like it's kind of like now we can see people kind of tweeting off the cuff and you're like, oh, like this person who I thought was really smart or like really great, turns out they're not. Or maybe they are really great at the thing that they're great at, but they're not great at other stuff. And maybe I shouldn't be listening to how they think about things that they know nothing about. And so being able to, I think, customize for those aspects would be nice. But I do think it is this issue of like labor, like feedback, interpretability of some of these controls, and how to bring it to people like in the moment, perhaps like opportunistically. Yeah.
Yeah, but like, do you think the systems even need to do that? Like, do you think the users themselves are also evolving on how they are getting affected by that?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think it depends on the platform. I think there are platforms where your relationship and your experience of the content on that platform is more passive. So I think of platforms that are more entertainment centric, like TikTok, for instance, where you are really there to be entertained, as opposed to maybe platforms where you're participating more, where you're part of a community, where you're trying to get information and like share your information or like have dialogue with others. So I do think that how these controls play out on different platforms is actually different because of user goals. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you for the talk. Really stimulating a lot of thoughts here. And these studies all sort of touch on very fundamental questions about community and power, because essentially it's about governance. So one question that I have is, a lot of these tools that you're building and the assumptions underlying those tools is that you have a firm grasp of people's identities, like, you know, who this person is. This is not a bot. This is not some anonymous user whose identity we do not know, right? So for a community to function, you need to know the members and have, you know, some clear definition of the boundaries of the community. So how do you kind of or you know, think about identities and sort of confirming or ascertaining people's identities in these Black communities?
Yeah, I think that's a really important challenge, particularly as we move away from the platform level. I think there's both challenges in that communities and users don't have as many resources or tools to be able to do things like do bot detection or that sort of thing, and kind of counteract maybe large scale attacks of some kind that they may be receiving compared to the platform. On the other hand, I think there are also some benefits to having communities, and particularly communities, I think, be thinking about this opposed to at the platform level, because when you are bringing some of this governance down to what I'll call like a more local level, you have a greater chance of having something where it's more about relationships as opposed to like accounts, if that makes sense. So like I am an admin of a Mastodon server where we are like getting applications of people to join the server and deciding as a moderation team who we want to have join or not. And as a result of that, we are like talking to people about who they are, why they want to join the server, what do they bring to the community. Those are not kinds of things you can do at a platform level. Like at a platform, you're just like maybe collecting phone numbers or emails or something, but you're not actually saying like, who are you? Like, why do you want to be here? How do you see yourself engaging with the other people here? And I think that that richer touch, I guess, is a way to think about this in terms of bots. You know, of course, if we were to get like thousands of automated account requests to our server, maybe they're using, I don't know, generative models to make themselves sound like humans or something, I do think at that point we would deal with issues because we're like a small moderation team and we might need like automated tools to deal with that or something. Yeah, that part remains to be seen. But for now, it's kind of having a more local structure here lets us think of people as people, and then being a bot is, I think, harder. Yeah. Yeah.
Thanks for the talk. So a lot of processes you talk about in this talk, they seem inherently hierarchical. Is it possible there are certain types of content that are so, you know, maybe they're inherently national or global that doesn't quite fit into like a certain leaf in this type of trees?
Yeah. I mean, yes, absolutely. I do think that, you know, my whole talk is kind of about bringing more power to users and communities, but I want to caveat that like this doesn't mean that platforms shouldn't do content moderation, and in fact, I still think they should do a lot, because there are some things that, you know, maybe are generally agreed upon to be harmful, or, you know, are actually illegal, and or are coordinated in some way where trying to like put volunteers or users in front of it is not tenable. I mean, we in our first interview where we talked to people about kind of this platform versus personal moderation aspect, people did talk about harm being kind of the thing that they were thinking about as the dividing line. So, you know, issues such as the vaccine, for instance, like vaccine misinformation, COVID misinformation as something that could be very harmful, and therefore like wanting the platform to take a stance on that and flow that down to users and communities. Of course, in our current polarized environment, in the US, like even something like that, I think is actually controversial. And we've also done studies on misinformation showing that kind of where that dividing line is actually also still difficult. So still needing kind of platform-wide processes for making decisions, I think, that are more legitimate. Yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. I think like so I'm very interested in this. So you've laid out this you know, in some sense, a design space for what different kinds of social media platforms could look like. And I'm wondering if like maybe, and I guess this is the question, is like, what is the ideal vision here? Should we try to populate this space and sort of aim for variation in the kinds of platforms so that people can build the kinds of communities they want on a platform that's most suited for that kind of community? Or do we want to actively move like certain spaces like Twitter more towards other spaces? Because I feel like right now, like, okay, Twitter serves a different function than like Reddit, and they lie in like different spaces of this design space. And in going from one to the other, like we also lose some things, right? So is your ideal vision like variation in platforms, or is it to sort of take existing platforms and like move them in certain directions? Like I understand some of this is just like the feasibility of prototyping that you take existing platforms, but like what do you think is the way to think about this?
Yeah. I'm actually a big proponent of diversity across platforms, and that goes towards differences in the things that you do on different platforms and the different goals that people have on different platforms, leading to differences in desire to participate in these kinds of things. Also scale. I think, you know, there are small platforms that are maybe the size of a community on another platform, and you just maybe don't need to have this much kind of like decentralization. I think the larger a platform gets, the more this actually not only kind of like arises naturally, like I do think that as a platform grows, you start to have like sub communities, even if they're not technically defined on the platform. And there then becomes, I think, a greater pressure to be able to have more personalized experiences, both user and community level, kind of as you get into the like millions, billions of users. It's just untenable to kind of keep this centralized model. So it's, I guess the answer is kind of like yes to both of your questions, or like both sides of your question. Like I do think that there should be variety in platforms, but you know, when it comes to big platforms, I do think we should be pushing them towards these more decentralized approaches.
And then do you think we lose anything in that process, I guess? Because like in the shift from Twitter to Mastodon itself, I've gone from thinking like, okay, I'm a lone user of Twitter, to now thinking, oh, like I'm indebted to the 5 people who are hosting my Mastodon server. In some point, I feel like I'm not contributing to that effort in any way. So there's also like some things we lose, I guess, in the process, right?
Yeah, and I don't think that Mastodon is decentralized Twitter necessarily. Mastodon is Mastodon, right? It has its own norms, it has its own like structure that is completely different, I would argue, from the way Twitter is. Like, I think a more decentralized version of Twitter is just Twitter, except you have more personalized controls and you have more ability to like incorporate like middleware, quote unquote, into your personalized controls. So you can, you know, share personalized controls with other people, for instance. Do you lose something? Potentially. There are instances I could see where maybe communities wouldn't necessarily interact quite as much as a result of controls that they've set that limit their visibility into other spaces. I think there's pros and cons of that though. Yeah, so one could make an argument that it's unhealthy necessarily for having that kind of, that degree of kind of like visibility into everyone else. Yeah, I don't know. I forget who has hand next.
You ready? No, no. Yeah. Okay. That's good. So I'm gonna get like it's very little naive, also probably grading. But what I'm trying to just think is going back to your point of this, decentralizing Twitter, for example, the issue is like, don't we have the
the control of the storage, and all the things belonging to one like body, one entity. I mean, it's not like an open source software that you can just post anywhere. So in that sense, some of the government need to actually consider those aspects of like the developers of the platform, the maintainers of the platform, and they kind of get a default right to what they set as correct or incorrect. So for example, some of these blue checks and yellow checks that they just want to like put it because it's Twitter. Like so, how would that play out? Like, would it be more sensible to kind of just have an open source, open kind of thing, or would it be like somewhere in between? I mean, I'm just trying to like summarize your thoughts for this question, because I think you're touching the point you talked about, like taking Twitter as an example.
Yeah. So I think what you're saying is that at the end of the day, the platform owns the architecture of these systems and the data. And so how would you still have some of these structures in place? Is that kind of, yeah, I mean, I do think that some of these things involve development by the platform itself to add some of these features. And if Twitter wants to do that, that's up to them. Maybe someone will make an alternative Twitter-like site that incorporates some of these controls. I don't know. Alternatively, there's the benefits of like kind of third-party tools. So, Twitter recently closed their APIs, so it's not possible to do this. But if platforms had open APIs that allowed for people to build tools that let people do things at a user level or at a community level, I do think that that would be beneficial. I am for kind of more regulation to support kind of API access to platforms to enable that kind of thing. But platforms could also do it themselves and open up their APIs. Yeah. Okay, I think you had a question and you, yeah. Okay.
So I was wondering how for some of this you would think it might translate the concept of originality as like translate to things like online harassment. I know we addressed it a little bit with SWOT talks, but one of the things like we see with dealing with harassment or like helping victims of harassment is that a lot of times it still gets the burden onto the victim to like protect their accounts, to like, do block lists, report things, etc., and they don't get the aid they need. And I know SWOT box kind of addresses it. I kind of got something to a trusted friend or moderator. But the thing with things like this is like these are still communities, so you still need people who have been targeted victims of these things of like S3D or S3D to be part of this discussion. And one of the things with like harassment is that they have chilling effects. We try to block platforms. People aren't willing to admit that they are victims or targets of harassment. So how do you make sure that these people can be involved in these conversations? And if they're involved, how do you make sure that the outcomes are equitable across different things? Because we see platforms try to address harassment, but the outcomes are absolutely not looking at platform whatsoever. Depending on how popular everything is. That was like 4 questions in one.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if I can address the popularity or fame aspect of it. I think that's a whole nother can of worms regarding platforms being kind of PR driven. However, this issue of harassment is important. I do think that it is, again, like an impossible task to ask platforms to necessarily be able to know about harassment or to be able to determine what is harassment, I guess, for people that are facing harassment. I mean, obviously there are very clear-cut cases, but there are also many cases where like you are being harassed, you retaliate, they harass you back. Like it's like hard to kind of like trace kind of what happened in some of these particularly like interpersonal disputes. So I think that there are things that platforms can do to deal with things like large scale attacks or like coordinated things or kind of long running issues of harassment or from particular accounts that are kind of like known bad actors. But in other cases, there has to be more kind of contextual input from the user to gain insight into this, because we think of platforms as this like amorphous thing, but it's actually like a person sitting somewhere in many cases in another country. If the report is in English may not even be their first language. Like they're trying to figure out what happened in this dispute between these like 5 people over here in this other country. It's like impossible. Yeah, so we have some work that's looking into like new forms of reporting structures. So reporting right now is very just like one way and like one time. It's like I send a report and that's it. And it's typically just like one message that I get to report once. And then I typically never hear back. But if I do hear back, it's just like, all right, we did something, or no, we didn't do something. We're thinking that potentially there could be more rich forms of reporting where you could, choose to report to the community moderator or choose to report to the platform. You could escalate to the platform from the community. The community or the platform moderator could maybe respond to you and say, hey, you gave us some information, but we couldn't quite figure out what's going on. Can you send us more information? Could you involve bystanders in your reporting? Is there a world in which like you and the reportee could actually like send competing reports to the platform? We see this sometimes in some cases offline with like sexual harassment reporting. So yeah, I think there's kind of like a richer space to have these harder, to deal with these kind of harder cases that in a way that still respects privacy, because I think that's also a concern. Yeah. Do you have a question? Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you, Emily. Great talk. So my question is about how do you think this kind of moderation affects the segregation of the information? Because it's essential that people can see different things.
Yeah, I guess my argument is that sometimes that's a good thing. I think there's oftentimes when I give talks regarding this, people often ask about things like filter bubbles or like echo chambers, like does it segregate society more? There have been some studies that have looked into this phenomenon of filter bubbles and like whether that increases polarization. And there's some evidence that it's actually the opposite, that like too much interaction with like outgroups or like this like polarizing content actually drives you to be more polarized. So I actually think that with the internet, we are seeing more content than ever before, more content from different perspectives than ever before, and that this is actually kind of like overwhelming and like disorienting for us, and that having spaces where we can like kind of have common ground and then have like more intentional experiences with other groups outside of that common ground would actually lead to better social experiences overall. And that's a very vague thing to say, but that's my high level thoughts on that. And I think the implementation of that would be, I don't know, up in the air right now, but those are my high level thoughts. Yeah.
Thanks.
You had another question?
I just want to follow up on this was my question as well about a lot of the issues that your work is tackling is hate speech and harassment, but some of the questions that I have is about societal integration and the veracity of information and truth claims. How can we sort of agree on what is true and what is fact?
Yeah.
Now, if you kind of move the power of the governance to the community level and to the individuals, and if there isn't some way of the individuals in different factions, for example, to communicate or come together, wouldn't that aggregate polarization? And this isn't just about filter bubbles per se, but more about I got information from this source and this is my belief what is true or what actually happened, and the exact opposite holds for another group. And if there isn't cross communication along those dividing lines, then how is integration possible? So
yeah,
in that diagram, the community, there are no lines between the communities.
Yeah, although there could be. This is just a
right.
Imagine.
I know.
Yeah.
But
yeah.
My point is, so is there actually a way, or how you're thinking about community to community connections, or how to sort of increase the mixing of individual members into these different communities so that there's sort of underlying connections between communities through the members.
Yeah. So I guess my argument here is that what you described is actually the status quo. Like, people today view different sources, are in different kind of spheres where truth is completely different compared to another sphere, and don't necessarily cross those boundaries. And when they do, it's often in a unhealthy way, I guess, or antisocial way. So I guess I would say, like, that's the way things are now. And I think that just putting people in front of each other who maybe hate each other, or shoving content from one community into another community isn't a way to have pro-social interactions, and isn't necessarily going to have actual exchange of thought. And I guess I feel that if we want to have more of that cross-partisan dialogue that's healthy, we have to actually design specifically for that interaction, as opposed to like hoping that it will naturally arise from just putting people that hate each other in the same room digitally, I guess. So yeah, and I think that actually, like, this is kind of pointing to the work that I was mentioning to your question, that actually putting people in the same room could actually drive them further apart. And maybe that's actually what we're seeing today, is one, that too much interaction with the other side is making us hate each other more. And two, that just seeing so much of it is overwhelming. And so I think some aspects of this might counteract that. It might exacerbate it. It's actually unclear. I'm not really sure. But the thing that I want to study is this kind of idea. This phrase I got from some news article somewhere. They called it epistemic respite, which is this idea of, like, instead of kind of being inundated with information, some of it contradicting, some of it just, coming from different perspectives, having a space to kind of like reflect and like just get respite, I guess. I'm trying to find the right word, but I can't think of it right now. But like, get respite from all of that noise. And maybe it's with people that you trust, right? And I do think something like these like top-down platform interventions that people have been studying, like adding information cards, etc., from like the CDC or from Wikipedia, I think those are good, but they're not going to work for everybody, because people have a mistrust of platforms. People have a mistrust of things like the CDC at this point, or like the New York Times, or like whatever authoritative outlet. And so we do have to think about these more like peer-to-peer trust networks and community-based responses to misinformation. And we do have some work that's looking at kind of peer corrections or peer response to misinformation and how to better support that, because I think that's really the way that you get at people on opposing sides. Yeah.